Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak before you all. This presentation has a bit of a different perspective, but people have hinted at it all morning and in the afternoon as well. For energy security, for sourcing, we've heard over and over again that traditional coal, oil, gas are going to need to be part of the solution for Indian self-sufficiency or security, if you will. Well, to achieve those ends, there still will need to be projects executed to produce that oil and gas, whether it's here in India or whether it's outside by Indian companies elsewhere. And what we want to understand is what is driving the performance of those projects so we can achieve better performance. And I'll tell you in a few slides why that's in your interest as well. In the current pricing environment, from what I've heard, reliable estimates matter more than ever before. In a high price environment, we can actually be a bit sloppier with our estimates. We can even withstand some cost growth. But in today's environment, you want to make sure that those estimates are reliable and that the achieved cost is competitive. And just to illustrate what I mean by that, think about today's price environment. In what part of the world do you think they're more likely to have problems getting projects out the door versus other parts of the world? What you're seeing here is data-based cost of installing a similar scope, a similar functional scope in terms of throughput, capabilities, water depth in different parts of the world based on not modeled forecasts, but based on actual real data in our database. And we have examples where we have twinned platforms built in a yard in the Gulf of Mexico, one installed in the Gulf of Mexico, one installed in West Africa. There's no basis for their costs being different, but the costs end up being very different. So what drives costs to be very different in one part of the world versus other parts of the world? And how can Indian projects or Indian operators executing projects outside of India understand what drives lower cost, better cost performance, and more reliable estimates? One of the ways we look at projects is we don't just consider the results, which is what you see on the right side of this flow chart. We consider the why a project achieves its performance. So you might be interested in facilities cost, wells cost, and production profile. Those are all very important, but how do you achieve good performance in those elements? Well, statistically, we can relate any and all of those drivers to the left of those costs with one or more of those outcomes. So a healthy subsurface understanding drives better, more predictable cost estimates and more competitive cost performance. Why is that? Why should facilities cost benefit from a good reservoir understanding? Well, if we have more certainty of our feedstock, more certainty of our fluids, and less surprises, we have less expensive changes in execution, and so on. And so what we do is we measure the level of definition of the reservoir, we measure the level of definition for the facilities and the wells, not only to tell you what the cost should be in your part of the world, but to be able to tell you why and how to achieve that. And I'll just focus down on one of them. Sorry, this is just to give you a sense of what the data is based on. It's a global distribution of projects, but just within Asia, we have some 930 observations of projects, detailed cost estimate, detailed technical scope, etc., that we're basing this on. Again, this is not forecast, these are actual results. And what you want to imagine is a cloud of projects here. We've just shown you the statistically linear regression because it's very robust that relates, for example, facilities front-end loading. And that's just from a facilities perspective. How detailed is your execution plan? How complete are your fundamental engineering deliverables? And we can relate that to cost growth. So what's implicit here is that if you understand how well defined certain things and what items have been done and not done at sanction of project, you can very realistically forecast what the cost growth will be for that project. What does that mean? In a low-cost environment, if you apply some of these challenges to what has been done, you can make more educated choices among different opportunities about which one is likely to be the most cost-effective and have the fewest unpleasant surprises in execution. And there are other relationships. So what I wanted to do is just give you a sense of what are the challenges we see in Asia or in South Asia, largely Indian projects, when we look at them. What you see on the spider plot are various outcome metrics. You'll see pointing straight up the cost index. So what does that mean? That means your cost divided by the industry should cost for similar scope is the index. So if you equal to what industry performs, it's a 1.0. If you're cheaper than industry, it's by 10%, you'd be at a 0.9. And you see very little difference in actual cost performance between Indian projects and the rest of Asia. Where we see the big difference is in predictability. The forecasts that are made at sanction are much less reliable than they are for projects we see executed elsewhere in India. That means schedule slip, which is the one you see on the bottom right. You see about 30% slip in India, about 10% elsewhere in schedule. You see cost growth in a couple categories, field labor, office cost, and if you're in a lower cost environment, maybe that's not as great a concern, but it's extremely prominent and sometimes embarrassing when we miss the first production date, sometimes by a year, sometimes 2. And again, these aspects of cost growth and schedule slip are extremely predictable at the sanction of a project based on what's done and what's not done. So I'll give you a bit more insights and data, and then I'll share with you some of what we've observed have been driving schedule slip in this part of the world. This is just to magnify the issue of schedule slip for projects. It's markedly different versus Southeast Asia or East Asia or any other parts of the continent. Most common driver of schedule slip that we've seen is engineering slip, right? It's common. We execute a project, we have a plan in place, we have a schedule. Boy, we're going to get into the field by this date, and even when engineering starts to slip, we're still going to go into the field. That's one of the most costly things you can do to a project in terms of its schedule. One of the best things you can do to mitigate that slip in engineering slip is to delay going into the field to let the engineering catch up. That hardly ever happens anywhere in the world. It's not just an issue here. But we often hear that vendors are busy, engineering contractors did not fully understand international standards or maybe standards in a different part of the world, even though they said they did. India engineering contractors included fewer details, what we've seen, fewer details on engineering drawings than US or European contractors. Details were expected to be field engineered. That's okay if everyone knows that's the case, but when we have international entities working together, they don't know what some of the assumptions are in different parts of the world of what complete engineering means. Low construction labor costs meant that fixing mistakes are relatively inexpensive. However, there's a schedule consequence that we're not really measuring when we think of it that way. Other examples that we've seen, we saw problems with engineering or vendor drawings. We saw lower than expected construction labor productivity. In the projects we've looked at, we have routinely measured the the labor productivity. It has consistently been less productive than what we thought it was in our estimates that we built. And of course, permitting. Permitting is a challenge in many parts of the world, but it has cropped up in projects in this part of the world more often than we see elsewhere. Some examples cited for lower than expected construction productivity. Direct supervision was not effective. We had a lack of craft workers. We had higher than expected turnover because of demand for resources. We had a demobilization of workforce when workers traveled home for festivals and to far distant regions. Those are all things that should be expected, but we're not factoring them into our schedule forecasts at sanction. They happen over and over again. At some point, we need to expect that they should happen and factor them into the forecast and not be surprised by the slip in the schedule. One of the last items I wanted to leave you with is that an extremely dangerous combination, in addition to going into the field even when the engineering isn't ready for it, is when owners are hands-off, especially when they're outside of their area of comfort. Previous presenter talked about significant number of Indian companies executing projects outside of India. To me, that always has a bit of a warning flag about what kind of expectations we're setting in our schedule and cost targets. Here you can just see the consequence of being hands-off as an owner company relative to contractors in terms of schedule slip and cost growth. And hands-off means more than half of the scope was left entirely to the contractor with little or no supervision. You may think, who does that? We have a significant number of projects in the database to be able to compare these two populations. It happens over and over again. When you choose to be hands-off, you can expect about 3 times the schedule slip as if you are hands-on. We think we're saving nickels and dimes by not having these project control supervisors in place, but it's extremely expensive when we don't have them in place. So I wanted to just leave you with some insights about those projects that are going to have to go ahead. How can we position ourselves to be competitive, because some projects will continue to happen. Those that are able to achieve reliable estimates and more competitive performance will have a leg up in this commodity industry where the lowest producer is going to have advantages of the high-cost producer. I wanted to keep it to the 15 minutes. I don't know if I'm available for questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.